Good morning. It's Thursday here at the bridge, and we are in the book of Proverbs, drawing out wisdom from the book that was written by Solomon, the wisest man in the world. And we come to Proverbs 18 verse 3, which is what we call a synonymous proverb. It's a proverb that has 4 lines to it, and the first 2 say something wise, and then the next 2 lines say it again in a slightly different way. It repeats the proverb in a slightly different words. Here it is, Proverbs 18 verse 3. When wickedness comes, contempt comes also, and with dishonor comes disgrace. Now, if you were to boil those 4 lines down into one, it might be something like, sin is a slippery slope. Our sin tends to go from bad to worse. That was true for King David, the great king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, because you remember the story. There was a day in David's life when his army was out fighting battles, and he was at home on the roof of his house, his palace. And it began quite innocently. He saw a woman. From the roof of his palace, he saw a woman, and she was bathing, and she was beautiful. And so David sent a messenger to find out about her. That was his first act when it became a slippery slope. He wanted to know more about her, and the messenger said that that's Bathsheba. And then he sent to get her to come to him. And then he committed adultery with her. He slept with her and sent her home. And then she became pregnant. And wickedness for David had become contempt. Not for himself, not for his sin, not for Bathsheba, but for her husband Uriah, who stood in the way of him getting away with this terrible sin. And so he arranged with Joab to have Uriah stand at the front of the battle line, and he was killed. And so David thought he had gotten away with it all. The sin had become the cover-up for the sin. And he went on with his life as though nothing had happened. Bathsheba became his wife until God called him on it, and it was exposed. And you remember the rest of the story, how the baby died, and David eventually confessed that sin in Psalm 51. But it had all begun with a fairly innocent act, a glance. He saw a woman, and rather than look away, he went down that slippery slope. Sin tends to go from bad to worse. Now, there is a New Testament verse in the book of James that's kind of a companion verse to this one in Proverbs. It's James chapter 1, verse 14. A man is tempted when he is drawn and enticed by his own evil desire. And desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. There's the slippery slope. Begins with a sin, and it goes from bad to worse. Ultimately, it brings forth death if it's unconfessed, unforgiven. And so James is basically saying, before sin puts you to death, put your sin to death, so that it doesn't become a slippery slope and go from bad to worse. And your sin, my sin, it doesn't have to be something as grievous and as horrendous as adultery and murder. It can be a careless word, an unkind action, or even thought. It can be something that we do that we shouldn't do, we know we shouldn't do, or something that we don't do that we know we should do. And it becomes a slippery slope. So don't allow that to happen in your life today. Sin is a slippery slope, and don't let it become that, but rather set out this morning to do the things you should do and not to do the things you shouldn't do. So God bless your Thursday. Take a look, if you weren't able to be with us last night, at our Bible study. No longer in the book of Jonah, but we are now in the book of Revelation. And have a great Thursday.